this RUN webinar. For the ones of you who don't know RUN is a network connecting practitioners involved in the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism across Europe. It was founded in 2011 by the European Commission, and it now includes over 6,000 practitioners from all Europe and from different work fields and backgrounds. The aim of RUN is to meet with other professionals to exchange ideas, knowledge, and experiences on the prevention and countering of radicalization and violent extremism. And we do so by organizing many meetings, such as working group meetings, thematic event, small-scale meetings, and webinar like this one. Now, the topic of the webinar, what we are going to discuss today. Today, we are going to address the topic of anti-government extremism and its impacts on our society. What is anti-government extremism? Why should we address it? Where the threats lie, and what are the challenges it poses to our democracy? Trust in government, legitimate protest, and we will look into the difference between legitimate protest and the criticism of the government policies and extremist behavior. And we will do so by looking at the issue from the local authority perspective and the police perspective. So we will start with my colleague, Stephen Leonis, who will set the scene and make sure we all have a clear definition of anti-government extremism. Annalie Portman, who will look at the issue from the local perspective and share her experience on the breeding ground and the vulnerable groups and individual to anti-government extremism. So let's get started with my colleague, Stephen Leonis, RUN practitioner, staff, and host of RUN Police Working Group. Stephen.
Yes. From the city of Amsterdam in the lovely little country of the Netherlands at the border of the North Sea. And we have a lovely little country, but we also have some issues. And I just grabbed some headlines that I picked up. Our government is struggling. It not only lost elections recently, there's also some issues around trust of people in politics, trust in the government. And we had some issues, for instance, a cabinet was fell because of, the cabinet fell because of a child welfare fraud scandal where the child welfare fraud service the tax service managed to make a big mess. The judge recently ordered that the border police should not do ethnic profiling anymore. When we are a very rich country because we take gas out of the ground, but as a result there were earthquakes and these decisions were not made very well. So there is a reason to criticize the Dutch government. So I can even understand that some people feel, for lots of reasons, anti-government sentiments. There's even protests. What you see here is the Minister of Finance visiting a rural area in the Netherlands. You can see the rural vehicle in the back on one of the pictures. She was received by torches. She's very often in the debate called a witch, a thing that female politicians face more often. There's a large protest against this oxygen measures that we have to take because of the environment. And she was confronted with an angry mob facing her with these fire. Some said we are receiving her with light and warmth. This was not how she perceived it, and this is not how the police perceived it, because in the past, for instance, the guy on the bottom of my slide, he is sentenced for, I think, 6 months because he showed up at the residentials, the home addresses of ministers with this big torch, shouting and threatening them with this torch of fire in his hands. So this was not a good scene. So we had anti-government sentiments for all kinds of reasons. We have protests, which is okay. This is protest. That's already, well, this is not okay, I would say. The guy on the bottom is part of an anti-government extremist milieu network, and he is, because he was showing up at these home addresses, he was sentenced. And then the last thing I would like to introduce is this lovely word of stochastic terrorism. And just to show you that I did not make up this funny word, Reed Malloy, Somebody, I think well respected, wrote in Perspectives on Terrorism about it. My simple version, if I talk about stochastic terrorism, is terrorism or political violence where you can expect it is coming. You can count on your fingers something is going to happen, like the January 6th siege on the Capitol. You knew something would go wrong. You don't know where exactly or when exactly or who's going to do it, but the conditions were met because of incitement, for instance, that political violence was about to happen. Molly Amman and Reed Molloy talk about historic examples, and you can see at the bottom of the little snippet this little quote. This is Henry II, then King of England in 1117, who was said to have raised his voice, saying, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" referring to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. I think he was critical on the king. That's what he did. He raised his voice and said, "Can somebody do something about this horrible man?" Not much later, 4 knights did something about this meddlesome priest. They went to Canterbury and slaughtered the archbishop. And the king was not present. But using these words, he is, you could say, many say, he is responsible for the political violence, the murder that followed, even though he did not ride out to go there, even if he did not pick up his sword, even if he didn't order the assassination, he could be seen as responsible. To sum up at the end, 2 more slides. In an open society, in a democracy, opinions and ideals are, well, stuff that makes a democracy or a living society. And even radical ideals are okay. This is why I make them green. In a democracy, you have the right to protest and demonstrate. There are some countries, Russia, for instance, where you're not allowed to do so. Demonstrations define democracy. If you can't demonstrate, if you can't come up on the street, assemble with your fellow fighters, then you're not in a democracy. I put civil disobedience here. Civil disobedience, the famous example is, of course, Rosa Parks, who was sitting in the front of a bus, on the front seat of a bus, holding a seat where she was not allowed to do so, but she did. And this is civil disobedience. This civil disobedience is definitely illegal. So civil disobedience is also, for instance, going to a road and sit on the road and block the road, for instance. Not legal, not allowed. So this is why I put it above the protest demonstrations, but it's something different from intentional violent protests and riots. If you look at the scenes in France at the moment, there are people with helmets, with sticks, with Molotov cocktails who go to a demonstration. But I would say I would call this intentional violent protest and riots. That's definitely not okay. The same ballpark is the non-violent or not yet violent extremism. And on top of that is the violent extremism. And some of them even go as far as terrorism. As you can see, the portions become smaller, 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 because some of the demonstrators might go into civil disobedience, and some of them might even go into using violence, and the groups become smaller, smaller, smaller. And this building, including where radicalization starts, it starts where demonstration is not being seen as sufficient anymore. I think pictured it well, and I think we need to keep in mind there's a big difference between demonstrations and anti-government sentiments and real terrorism or violent extremism on the top. To sum it up, it's about protest. Protest is okay. It defines democracy. Rough and naughty protest and some pushing and pulling with the police. I think most police will say this is something we can cope with. We've seen it before. People who would like to live a sovereign lifestyle, and not want to be left alone and grow their own vegetables and go off the grid and want to be free like hippies. We've seen it before. Anti-government sentiments and antitrust issues, well, in some cases, they're to be expected, and we need to work on it. We need to deal with it. But this is all small issues. But in combination with democracy undermining conspiracies, agitators and political entrepreneurs who use social media or sometimes even a parliament to stoke the fire, sovereign citizens movements obstructing and undermining government authorities with citizen arrest and diplomatic immunity, violence-oriented extremism joining and instigating, then it's becoming damaging to democracy and open societies, and even dangerous because it takes out the oxygen or the social cohesion out of society. Polarized societies and authorities which are delegitimized cripple the capacities of democracies to face huge challenges, and we do have some challenges. Climate change, the war, economic reforms, housing markets, migrations. There are some things we need to solve as a society. And in a polarized society where authorities are delegitimized, that is an issue that's much more difficult. If politicians and civil servants are being intimidated, it might influence their work. They might not feel safe anymore to say in a parliament what they think, to do their work as they should be doing. So if they're intimidated or attacked, it might even hamper the recruitment. I think it was a Norwegian research indicating that there are a lot of political talents, people who'd like to be a chosen politician and playing a key role in democracy, who shy away, who say, well, if this is how we play democracy, we're not doing it anymore. So very good political talents and people who could really serve their country in democracy don't want to do this work anymore because of the climate, because of the threats and the attacks. And in the end, it creates a permissive climate for vigilant justice, citizens doing all kinds of funny stuff or horrible stuff, political violence, or even the stochastic terrorism, the terrorism that you knew was coming, but you did not know who was going to do it and where. Lone wolf attacks fit in this as well. If there's this climate where many people are angry and saying things about the witch and she should be burned and things like that, there is this fear that some lone actors might do something. And then to conclude, Mala said, I'm going to give a clear definition of anti-government extremism. Well, I think most experts will agree with me that there's no such thing as a clear definition. But I took one from the Dutch National Coordinator, NCTV. They issue a report every 3-4 months to inform policymakers and all the others in society about trends and developments. And for, I think, 1 or 2 issues now, they added to the main topics being violent jihadism, being right-wing extremism, they're now adding anti-government extremism as an important issue that people should be aware of. And they describe it as, there's a group of anti-government extremists in the Netherlands, which, prompted by deep-seated distrust, anger, and feelings of injustice, is agitating against the government and other institutions. This group, which emerged as a radical undercurrent of the coronavirus protest movement, is shifting its focus to other matters, such as the controversy around the nitrogen emissions and the restructuring of the farmer and agricultural thing. A subset of this group endorses conspiracy theories. So it's a blurry picture. Conspiracy theories undermining public trust in our democratic institutions and rule of law. These are the QAnon stuff, the World Economic Forum kind of conspiracy theories, and also horrible things like Great Reset and Great Replacement. And the spread of these theories The spread and normalization of such theories could lead to extremist and even terrorist acts. I think this is what I tried to build up in my story before. So my last words, and then I'll go over to Malazi's. Nota bene.
Thank you.
This is
Thank
not
you,
the
Steve.
same as anti-government sentiment or protest. And this is a point I want to make clear, and I think some of the others will do this as well.
Our next speaker, Annelie Portman. Annelie is an experienced senior specialist who currently works at the Finnish Institute for Healthcare and Welfare in Finland. Annelie is an excellent professional who collaborates with other experts on the development of PVE tools and interventions. Annelie's background includes working as a researcher for the University of Helsinki and for the city of Helsinki as well. And at the moment, Annelie is a member of the RUN expert pool, and she is the RUN working group leader of RUN Local.
Thank you. Now I rely on Martin to share the slides. Thank you. So it fell on me to look at the local perspectives of this, because obviously anti-government extremism, in one sense, by definition, is something that involves the entire state, and therefore it will look very different in different member states. So in my presentation, what I will look at are the kind of common denominators all of us face in looking at this locally. So if you could put the next slide in. First of all, I want you to take a close look at the monster. It's a hydra. So it's by definition a beast with many heads. And anti-government extremism or anti-system, or it has like many names, is something that pops up every once in a while in different places, different disguises, with different voices, but it has certain common elements, certain elements that always join it. So for instance, here in Finland, we now are having elections this coming Sunday, parliament elections. And this time, this anti-government extremism or anti-government protests take the face of people dressed in white hazmat suits, carrying coffins, but still the message is the same. That whereas before they might have had, for instance, the masks of the of all kinds of or masks or unmasked, but still of conveying the idea that there's a conspiracy going on. So at the very core is the idea that the system itself is evil, and therefore its local representatives on whichever level are evil as well. In what way is the system evil? Well, mainly because it's seen to intentionally curb civil liberty or intentionally to damage the normal citizens. There is an idea that there is a secret elite, be it financial or political elite, that runs everything. And so even where in a democratic system you have people who have one opinion, people who have another opinion, there might be really heated discussions, but you generally tend to think that even though the people are different, we can still have a dialogue. This assumption that the system is evil says, well, on the surface they seem to disagree, but actually they're all paid by the same source. This anti-government approaches like this that marry the conspiracy ideas often also accuse the Jews being behind it all. So there is a strong element of anti-Semitism woven into this. Well, how does it look like on a local level? The system, if it's seen as evil, comprises antagonism towards schools, towards healthcare, social services or police. For instance, one of the conspiracy theories that fuel anti-government sentiments in the Nordic countries lately has been a completely unfounded claim that social services target Muslim children in order to take them away from their parents and to put them into Christian families so as to raise them Christian, or to put them in same-sex families so as to erode the idea of gender differences. Now, this has no backing, but it has been spread with the same, through the same circles that would engage in a belief of the system as evil in general. So we can see that then the real life consequences of this anti-government extremism is not necessarily on a state level, so such as what we saw on January the 6th in Capitol in the US, but can also be seen as harassment, opposition, or threats against social services in very, very local circumstances. Another common factor is that it's transnational. We can see it in the protests that were happening in different places during COVID, or during the COVID pandemic being more in force than it is now, when it's fortunately waning, where the similar protests and similar arguments, regardless of what would have made sense in the local circumstances, were voiced throughout. So here again, for instance, not only the idea of the elite trying to limit citizens, but there was also the idea that the elite is lying about the nature of the pandemic. Interestingly, this transnational assumption of pandemic being a hoax or an invention, the moment the Ukrainian war started, a lot of these voices died down and became voices that said that the whole war is not a war, that Putin is right, that etc. So all of a sudden, you can see that the transnational nature of this anti-government extremism is really like a hydra, that it pops up differently, whatever is convenient in the moment. So it tries to fuel a discussion that would, in general, create either polarized societies or increase the distrust in local or state level government. Well, if you like, following on from what Stephen was saying, the problem is not that if our governments do a bad job, of course we should criticize them. But in order to change that, usually the means the democratic societies use is that we have an election. Even if it's like having an election before its time, we elect people and we change the laws through the representatives who decree those laws. So instead of changing laws because there's an outcry of some nature. So one of the dangers of this anti-government extremism is what Stephen was alluding to, is that it silences people. And it also creates a different kind of elite, so that those who have access to the echo chambers, who have access to online influencers or their forums, all of a sudden become kind of like the lobbyists of tendencies. And so nobody has elected them. They don't answer to anyone, but they still try to exercise a very powerful influence. So therefore, the anti-government extremism taken in this way actually undermines democracy. Another common factor are the online influences. The online influences take many forms and shapes. For instance, the fake news can result in very, very real local riots. There was an incident in the US where there was a creation of very realistic YouTube clips, news interviews, etc. But all of that was a fake news about the police allegedly killing a Black woman, but that resulted in real life riots. So with real life people getting hurt, real life riots, and all of that was started online, and all of that was a fake news based thing. So the anti-government, anti-elite, and in this case presumed elite, gets fueled by online discussions that may have transnational origin, like it was in this case, but yet the results are very real and very local. So, who are the ones who are vulnerable? In the next slide, Martin, I would thank you. So, who are the vulnerable local groups? All those who feel that they have been excluded. This little thought bubble here is a kind of prompt for the participants to think, who are they in your local context? Because these obviously vary from country to country. So that when there are people groups, either ethnic, age, gender differing groups who feel that they are systematically excluded or that they don't have a say, it then leads to a general feeling of nothing that the local authorities do actually has anything to do with me. And so whatever mechanisms we've used for societal cohesion is not working. So for instance, during COVID, whatever we tried to do obviously was hindered by the fact that everybody had to stay at home, varying measures. So how do we preserve societal cohesion? Or for instance, there have been attempts to participatory budgeting, where citizens can vote what the common joint resources, financial resources, will be used to. What we found out is that they're still used, the people who vote are still the same who would be participating anyway. So there are clearly cliques or groups of people who seem to fall through our cracks. And if we look at this from the point of anti-government or anti-system mechanisms, what that leads to is that they are vulnerable to messages that say, look, you're not part of us anyway. You never were. We don't want you. The society is against you rather than being for you. That is problematic when we all try to do a society that would take care of its weakest members. Various systems of welfare society are built on the assumption that we are all in it together. So that leads to the most vulnerable being those who actually would mostly need our support, who would need the support from people. So the marginalized, the more poor, the more stigmatized, if they systematically feel that they are excluded, believe the messages of conspiracies being directed against them, then they become the targets. They become the targets of this anti-government mobilization, like in Stephen's cake-like image. You start to slowly move higher in towards radicalization. Well, the reason for these grievances, for these feelings of exclusion, sometimes are real life grievances. So obviously there can be systematic or systemic problems, but then at the same time, this exclusion can be also opinion based. So, for instance, when the first in case of COVID, when the first studies of the use of masks came, our government literally silenced the beneficiality of use of masks, not because they thought that that's the best evidence, but because there were not enough masks available. So they didn't want to alarm people. So that obviously in the long run fueled into this. So what else is the government lying about? And when people started to be affected by COVID, either long COVID or they had loved ones who died, etc., there was this general already prepared ground for the government being seen as untrustworthy. So the grievances that are not listened to can become the breeding ground of actual conspiracy beliefs, of actual kind of like such deep distrust in the government that the logical outcome some sort of protest or some sort of withdrawal. And I briefly saw there in the chat a question about the overlap with the wellness spirituality industry, especially in regarding COVID. That's really, really true. We saw all over the world, but it's all over Europe in our case, of all kinds of improbable links, where especially people, for instance, in the yoga and that sort of health wellness industry, were promoting all kinds of conspiracy beliefs and all kinds of remedies for COVID, which we now know didn't work. And who were the targets? The ones who were most vulnerable. Financially excluded groups are obviously also at the receiving end of being very vulnerable, because they might not have the means to address their grievances without help. And so they are at the receiving end also of these messages. See how wrongly you're treated. And for instance, now with the Ukrainian refugees flooding Europe, there are these voices saying, oh, okay, so we give all these benefits to Ukrainian refugees, which were previously denied from other refugees. And so we have a real life crisis again, resulting in the discussion of exclusion. Of course, this could be discussed in a not disruptive way, where we could look at how people actually receive, what sort of subsidies they need, what's a more equitable way of distributing them. But if they get targeted by all these conspiracy belief type of messages, then it's difficult to actually have a dialogue. So what can we then do? What can local authorities do on a practical level? And again, maybe if we have the next slide, that the first thing local authorities need to do is to restore trust. Now, how you do that depends on your local context. Usually from crisis communication studies, it emerges that trust is built when you don't lie. When the authorities tell how things actually are, even when the things are going badly or have been done badly, the sooner you admit that you've screwed up, excuse my wording, the better it is. So if you try to patch things up and say, well, there's nothing to be seen, there's nothing to be worried about, in general, that is not believable. So the sooner you admit what is and what isn't, and try to be as honest and as wise in your communication, the better it is. The better it is in restoring trust of the citizens. Drivers of distrust usually are things where the recipient of the communication has a reason to believe that they are not treated equitably. So, for instance, in the case of social services targeting Muslim kids, one of the ways to dismantle that ethnic group or religious group affiliation belief of being and the receiving end of all kinds of injustices is to, for instance, share statistics. Who's done what, where, when, and why? Because often the social services, for instance, obviously cannot share personal information. They can't talk about individual cases. What they can do is to share accurate statistics. How many kids, where? That sort of information. So usually the drivers of distrust have to do with vulnerability. They have to do with what group you belong to, what the contextual assumptions of the treatment of that group are. And so, for instance, if you think that simply because you belong to your group, you are unjustly blamed for societal problems, you will be very distrustful of any communication you receive. So sometimes there is a need to make sure that you talk with a voice and in with a way that the people whom you want to reach actually can receive it. So clear communication. Use the language you need. It needs to be clear enough. Timing, as soon as you can talk, and make sure that you as a local authority are available for citizens to contact you, that there are clear channels of how to voice their grievances, and that there are safe spaces to doing so, that they know that they can criticize you and be heard without that resulting in them being excluded from some services, for instance. And the grievances really, really need to be listened to. Online, local authorities need to be present, not just to monitor in a minority report way, but to be there to talk with people. So to dismantle the fake news and other forms of disinformation as they happen, not to let them just fester and mushroom. And then my last slide, which are the actors that need to be involved in this? Could we have the next slide, Martin, please? All the relevant people need to be on board. So again, a multi-professional, a whole society approach is the best. And there are not everybody wants to listen to you in particular. So you need to have allies, as it were, who can speak for you. So for instance, sometimes local groups have less reason to trust, for instance, social workers or the police, but they can trust associations or other civil society organizations better. So make sure that you, as a local authority person, have relationships with all the relevant actors, that you know who they are, they know you, and that you build the relationships as you go. It's usually more beneficial to build bridges before you need them than try to panic build bridges when things are already burning. So therefore, make sure that you relate to people as human being to another, and that you know what your professional, your in your circles, what they do and who they are, what their professional competencies or specific cases that they can work with are, and be ready to meet and treat people as people. Because often in communication, they're also from the local authorities, if we label people as troublemakers, they usually become precisely that. My last slide was just saying thank you.